Chapter 2. In a blink, reality replaced the vision. King Solomon's desperate fall from the ridge had progressed not an inch from where he had been when the vision first overtook him. Time had halted while he was away. Awareness of the present now rushed back upon him. He had been hiking in the wilderness and tripped near a ridge and was falling, still. Now he caught a fleeting glimpse of the shadowy bottom rushing quickly up from below. In a mental reflex, he reached again for his gift of wisdom. But before it could be grasped, the present escaped him again, as a bird from the fowler, and another vision flooded in. He found himself floating above the crowded assembly hall of David's palace. A young boy was craning his neck to see over the taller people standing in front of him. The boy could only achieve a partial view of the drama in the royal court, but his intrigue was genuine. He was more sharply attentive than anyone guessed. "Will none dare to accept our challenge?" The crier's voice echoed in the royal court, the stone walls reverberating until the sound faded into a cool silence. The crier and his master had been given entrance to the royal palace to present an evening of entertainment. They offered a bag of jewels to anyone who could best their champion in a battle of wits. "A jewel for us if we win, the whole bag for you if you win," the crier added, searching the room with challenging eyes. King David and the royal court were amused by the colorful Arabians. Win or lose, they brought drama to the court, presented themselves with flair, and promised an evening of first-class entertainment. They were professional entertainers, clever and convincing, offering a rich reward to anyone who could defeat them. The wisest men in many great kingdoms had already fallen before their challenge. Their champion, Malaki Banishi, a figure imposing in confidence, sat before a gaming board topped with strange carved pieces of white and black arranged on marble and ebony squares. Joab, the Israelite general, had tried first, not that he considered himself wise, but he was by nature a battler and did not want to be found shrinking from any challenge. Malaki Banishi had finished him off quickly, and Joab good-naturedly dropped a jewel into the bag of his vanquisher. "And it is published that Israel is haunted with wise men as numerous as the jewels of Ophir," the crier called in exaggerated surprise. "Never before have I encountered a report so at odds with the reality." The room was tensely quiet, as the attentive occupants watched nervously to see who would step up next. Quiet urges and friendly ribbing passed among the attendees. Many wanted to try, but realized their chances of beating the master at his own game were slim. The torches grasping the high stone walls cast curious shadows over an array of amused and pensive faces. Visibly stationed were the high princes, Adonijah, Amnon, Absalom, beautiful, proud, superbly attired, glowing like ornaments in their customary place to the right of the king. King David looked over at his sons, who exchanged amused glances with him and one another, but moved not. "Oh, King David," the crier called out, "the valiance of your underlings shamefully fails them. Are we forced to conclude that there is but one wise man in all of Israel, and he is already fallen? Have you not another? The kings of Midian produced for us no less than 12 men of wisdom, who vexed us for 24 hours. David was smiling. Suddenly, there was rustling at the back of the room. Heads turned toward the noise. "The prophet Nathan," someone whispered. The crowd parted, revealing a plainly dressed, rugged old man with a staff. Nathan stood before the court. The attention of all was fixed upon him, for wherever the prophet walked, drama followed. Malaki Banishi and the crier exchanged a glance and studied the strange-looking old man. "Is this the wisest in all of Israel?" the crier asked. Nathan offered no response. The crier glanced at his partner, then back at Nathan. "Let him come forth and display his wit." Silently, Nathan shuffled forth to stand before the crier, not uttering a word. After a moment of curious examination passed between the gamesman and the prophet, the crier asked, "Were you here to learn the rules?" "I have not come to play," Nathan said, shifting his gaze to the gamesman from the crier. Murmurings echoed in the room. "For I'm not the wisest in all of Israel," he added. The gamesman cocked his head curiously. The observers rustled. "However," Nathan continued, "the wisest is in this room tonight." The room's occupants exchanged curious glances. The high princes hesitated to take their eyes off the old prophet for even an instant, apprehensive that he might call on one of them.
"Is he then going to come forth?"
exclaimed the crier in an exaggerated voice. Nathan stared at him a moment, then turned away. Solemnly, he moved, the crowd parting before him like falling stands of wheat, until he came to the back of the room and stood before the youth who had been so attentive from the beginning. A slender 12-year-old boy with wavy black hair and dark eyes. Every gaze followed. The prophet approached and stopped right before the boy. The eyes of the boy grew wide. Nathan extended his hand. "Come, son." Adonijah stifled a laugh and looked at his brothers. The boy Solomon blushed, his ears burning red with embarrassment. He took the hand of the prophet and was led past his two living older brothers, Shobab and Nathan, past Joab, Benaiah, and the chiefs of David's mighty men, past the skeptical eyes of the high princes, dignitaries, elegant queens, David's wisest men and advisers, and was brought to stand in front of Alaki Benishi, the master of the strange game of wit. The gamesman looked amused. "Am I to understand that this is the wisest in Israel?" he asked. "No." The gamesman stared at the prophet blankly. "Before you stands the wisest in the world." Audible gasps were heard. If the declaration had come from any but the prophet, they would have been laughs. The old gamesman, not familiar with the prophet, was in truth amused. The old man studied the boy curiously, then glanced back at the prophet, a trace of a smile on his savvy old face. He flicked his eyes over toward his crier and back. The crier winked. "Indeed," said the gamesman. "Have you a jewel, my boy?" Suddenly the voice of David was heard. "He does." Heads whipped around to behold King David descending from his place of honor to draw near and put his arm around the boy. "Take courage, son," he said. "I know what it is like to stand before a giant. Remember who called you here, and do your best." He placed a jewel on the table next to the gaming board. "Very well," said Alaki Benishis. "As I explained to my last opponent, the pieces move in this fashion," said Alaki Benishi. "I understand the game," the young Solomon cut him off. The gamesman looked up curiously. "From back there?" Solomon blushed and nodded yes. "Well then," said the master, "nothing hinders that we may begin, but you understand that an illegal move results in a loss." Solomon nodded. The gamesman positioned himself behind the board, glanced up at his young opponent and back at the game, then ceremoniously moved a piece to the center. Solomon reached out with a slender white hand and replied. After several moves, it was evident to Alaki Benishi and everyone in the room that the young Solomon had indeed caught the sense of the game, even from the back of the room where he had deliberately hidden himself, as was his habit. After several more silent moves, Solomon suddenly gasped in self-disgust. After 3 more moves, it was over. "That was well done, son," Alaki Benishi said, taking the jewel into his bag. "For a first time, that was perhaps the best I've seen." Solomon was not looking at Alaki Benishi. He did not seem to hear him at all. His eyes were fixed on the board, darting back and forth vigorously. The gamesman was waiting for some courtesy from the boy and looked around curiously. "Again," Solomon whispered. The room rustled. Alaki Benishi looked up peculiarly and over at the crier. The crier looked over at the king. David descended to the center once again. "Very well," he said with an odd smile. "One more jewel." He placed it next to the board and returned to his seat.
Alaki Benishi reached out and ceremoniously opened exactly as he had in the prior game.
The young Solomon stared at the gaming board. Time passed in silence. He continued to stare. The sights and sounds around him faded away like a dream while the game before him became the whole world. He placed both his hands on the sides of his head and leaned forward. He felt his consciousness changing as though he were descending into a tunnel. There was a flow around him, first a trickle, growing to a stream, then a torrent, a flood of minutiae, coursing through and around his awareness, his thoughts speeding forth, darting and dancing over the patchwork before him, chain upon chain upon chain. The room grew tensely quiet. After several long minutes, the slender white hand rose again and placed the piece. Differently than before, Alaki Benishi did not respond instantly this time. After a moment of thought, the master moved again. Solomon again remained still for several tense minutes before moving another piece. The master paused once more, longer this time. So it went, Solomon carefully considering, Alaki Benishi taking more time for each reply, the curious glances cast at his young opponent gradually giving way to more urgent ones. As the game wore on, the old master of the game of wit began exceeding the young Solomon in the time he took to consider his moves. Pieces danced and shuffled on the gaming board, and trades ensued. The crier was scowling at the board and at the lad, glancing nervously at the bag of jewels. One by one, the game pieces left the board and took up new positions alongside it. After nearly an hour of tense silence, only a fraction of the original objects remained, and the breathless crowd had crept forward in silent attention. That would be all, Alaki Benishi whispered after a complicated exchange that left hardly anything on the board. What happened? David asked.
There is no longer enough material for victory. The game is a tie,
he explained. David looked around. The crowd whispered one to another.
What happens now?
The third game, Solomon replied. His eyes remained locked onto the board as if nothing else in the world existed. The old master wiped sweat from his forehead. The crier looked nervously at the bag of jewels, then over at Alaki Benishi. The Arabian partners exchanged an eloquent glance.
The great Alaki Benishi maintains a 2-game limit for any single opponent,
the crier suddenly declared. The assembly moaned loudly in disappointment. Voices began to chorus in protest. Of course he does, the casual voice of David cut into the room, causing the protests to fall silent as he walked down to place his hands on the shoulders of the young Solomon. He stood before the gaming team, a twinkle in his eye. Of course, the great Alaki Benishi has a 2-game limit. He's an old man, and Solomon young and strong. An old man cannot be expected to continue such strenuous concentration as long as this tender youth. But the court of Israel does thank you for a night of fine entertainment, he said to them with a smile. David picked up the jewel he had placed beside the board and dropped it into the bag. For your kindness in showing us what indeed dwells among us, he explained. You may return and try again at a time of your own choosing. Come, son, he said to Solomon, patting him on the shoulder. I have a jewel for you also. The Arabian gaming team looked relieved. The audience looked amazed. Adonijah and the other high princes looked sullen. And the entourage of gaming Arabians never again returned to cast their challenge before the courts of Israel. The scene faded to black, and instantly Solomon was back in his desperate plunge, his mind quick enough to calculate in a flash that he had descended several cubits during the last vision. He would impact the bottom in under a second. But again, before he could act, the present escaped, and he found himself in Egypt, a young prince on an educational journey, part of his training to take the throne of Israel. The city of Pharaoh spread before him as he stood gazing out from the parapet.